Okay, you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Nicole Levy, a fair banking expert and member of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. Our own Denise Clay-Murray will give us a preview of her weekly column that will be in the Hall Monitor Weekly Dispatch this Friday. And our own Lance Haber will also be talking about the public bank today and how debt service works. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. I'm looking forward to hearing about the public bank.
Yeah, it's going to be a good show, an interesting topic that we've talked about before, but there's been a twist in where we are with the public bank. And I think Denise Clay-Murray is here with us as well.
Yes,
hello, Denise. How are you?
I'm good. How are you both?
Doing well. Doing
good.
well.
Good.
So we have a big show tonight, a lot going on. So we're going to lead off tonight with our interview with Nicole Levy of the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition. All right, Nicole Levy, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Larry. Denise, thanks for having me today.
So we've been talking about the concept of a public bank for a while on our show. Honestly, I was thinking about it. I think it's the first thing I ever talked to former council member Derek Green about. Years ago, we were discussing this. It's such an interesting idea, and we've kind of watched it go from a plan to legislation to where we are now. But before we get to where we are now, can you tell us a little bit about what a public bank is?
Great, sure. I love that question. It's very big. And to approach it, I like to take a step back and think about a few things. One, why public banking is important. What are the sort of needs, the overriding needs here in Philadelphia? And then before we think about a public bank, I think it's important to think about what is banking, what is the banking landscape in Philadelphia, and then we can begin to think about how it fits in. So if you all can sort of bear with me for a minute, my bank background is really in banking, like bank law, sort of racial equity and data. So I have a few slides here that sort of get at the nexus of those things that I think might be helpful for this discussion, and I can pull those up now. I'm going to do a screen share. Are you all seeing?
Oh, I see. Yep. Okay, there you go.
We can see
there
that.
We go. All right, so this is where I want to start. And unfortunately, we're in a position here in Philadelphia where we need to start every conversation with the topic of gun violence and the gun violence epidemic. And in order to do that, we really need to think about the root causes of what's happening in our neighborhoods, right? And here we're talking about redlining. Redlining, we know, was institutionalized by the federal government back in the 1930s, but it hasn't stopped since then. It continues to this day. And this chart here shows a sort of narrow snapshot of that picture and what it means in our neighborhoods. This is home loan data in the city of Philadelphia for the year 2021. And it breaks down all mortgage loans that were made in that year by race. So we can see 47% of loans went to white borrowers in Philadelphia, and just 18% went to Black borrowers in Philadelphia. Now, we know the demographics of this city well. It's equally Black and white. So when we take that little rectangle above Black borrowers and we equalize it to whites and we say, hey, let's imagine a reality for Philadelphia where Black residents have the same access to credit as white residents, we would have had 3,900 more mortgage loans in Philadelphia, totaling about nearly $1 billion. And I think it's really important for us to spend a minute and think about the scale of that disinvestment and what it means for our neighborhoods. We are asking, because of the history of racial segregation and housing segregation, we are asking our Black neighborhoods to get by with $1 billion less in loans for home improvement and home ownership than we have in our white neighborhoods. That's staggering. And that's a year-over-year number. Every year, we're asking Black neighborhoods to get by with $1 billion less in home lending than our white neighborhoods. A good friend of mine was asking me about mortgage data, similar mortgage data by gender earlier this week, and we were looking at some of the numbers. And surprisingly, if you look at single males and females overall, the numbers are pretty equal. But where the numbers really drop is when you focus on and isolate single male homeowners. Those numbers are so small in this city. And I think it's really helpful to envision a future for our city where everyone can dream of home ownership and what that does to our neighborhoods, their well-being and their ability to thrive. So we know when we look at the data on both mortgages, on small business, that there's a lack of investment, a lack of monies flowing into Black and brown neighborhoods in this city. And that's a big problem that we all need to think about and grapple with. The second chart, I guess, that I like to look at is thinking about, and anytime you as an individual set out to make your financial plan, you start with what you have, right? What do you have in the bank? And this picture right here is what we as Philadelphians have in the bank. We have a population of about 1.5 billion people, around 21,000 registered businesses. And collectively, here in the county of Philadelphia, this is the money that we all have sitting in our checking and savings accounts right now, $67 billion. This is actually a lot of money. If you look across the nation, the Philadelphia metropolitan area is the 7th largest deposit market in the nation. And that's out of 393 different metropolitan areas. This is a very big and lucrative market for banks. But what happens when you dig into that $67 billion and the data that the FDIC makes available, you see that virtually all of this money, all of this wealth that's ours, is held by large corporate banks. We're talking about Bank of America, Wells Fargo, TD Bank, banks who are not headquartered here locally in our city. And when you think about how banking works, this becomes pretty immediately concerning, right? We know that banks, it's a simple business banking, right? They take in deposits and they reserve about 10% of that, sometimes a little less. And then the rest of that money, they lend out, they invest in home loans, in credit card loans, in auto loans, student loans, small business loans, and they earn profits back for their executives and shareholders, right? So if we think about 90% of the wealth of this city being held by corporate banks who aren't headquartered here locally, those investments are going many different places, right? Whereas if we had more of our wealth held by local institutions, they're going to be making investments naturally in local businesses and local neighborhoods. But we don't, right? So that's not the picture that we have in Philadelphia. We don't have a lot of homegrown women and minority-owned banks. We don't have a Philly-based regional bank like PNC, and we don't have a public bank. When you look at the 10% of our local deposits that are held by what we can consider local banks, most of them are actually headquartered just outside the city, like Fulton Bank, Univest, sort of smaller little regional suburban-based banks. So there's a real lack of local financial institutions here in the city. So one of the things that we can think about if we want to increase investments back locally, we can increase the number of local institutions who are holding deposits, right? So that's one way, one sort of lever we have to pull. One other lever that we have as a city that I want to highlight is that box there at the bottom. And that's that there's a lot of banking laws out there that banks are subject to. Things like the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to make loans in low and moderate income communities, both mortgage loans and small business loans, and to make a wealth of other investments in low and moderate income communities. We don't really have an authority or anyone locally here in Philadelphia who's actively monitoring banks' performance under the Community Reinvestment Act. These examinations are made public. We in the public have the ability to speak up and inform the local concept of what our needs are here in Philadelphia. We have the ability to get involved when banks apply for mergers and acquisitions through the Federal Reserve to really sit down with those banks and ask that they make larger community commitments in the city. And we're not really pulling those levers that much. So that's the Community Reinvestment Act. Then there's a body of fair lending law, things like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act. Investigations and enforcement of those laws is not what it needs to be when you look at the disparities, as we just saw on the previous slide here in Philadelphia. So there are things that we could do in the city to make that data more transparent and be more active in working with the banks that are doing business here in Philadelphia to make sure that they are enforcing those laws. One other way is we have the city of Philadelphia, the government has authorized 13 depository institutions to hold the city's funds. We can make CRA performance and fair lending performance a contingency for the acceptance of those funds. These are all things that are on the books, laws right now that we could be using better, making better use of, but we just aren't. So I think as I look at this picture, I like to think of the pie of money, the sort of pot of money that we have in Philadelphia, and things that we can do today to increase the monies that are of that pot that are being reinvested back locally in Philadelphia. And then this is just one final picture, just specifically to focus on small business. And you can see what large banks in the city are doing right now for small business lending. It's a very small amount. This data is from 2019. We can see that all small business loans in Philadelphia in 2019 totaled just $308 million. I know that there are bank executives who have yachts that cost more than $308 million. This is not sufficient investment in our small businesses, right? The one other thing that's interesting in this data is when you plot it, you can see the census tracts where the businesses are located who received these loans. So here they're plotted by the income tract category. And you can see that the overwhelming majority of the volume of loans went into extremely upper income neighborhoods. And I almost, this picture to me almost looks like, it's like you can see our upper income neighborhoods afloat on this buoy of credit from lenders, right? And imagine if we could spread more of that credit around into some of our other neighborhoods, what that might look like. So let me stop there. And I think the final point I just want to make is one, banking is pretty simple. We take deposits in, we use them to reinvest. Banks are not investing enough in our communities right now. And the kinds of investments that make our neighborhoods and our people thrive are really investing in home ownership and investing in small businesses. So these are areas where we have very big gaps right now as a city. And I think that is what we need to start talking about addressing and filling those gaps. So let me pause there before we pivot then into how public banking and the authority fit in. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, and that would be my next question, because when we look at all these issues, and one thing I really appreciate is the way you sort of frame that, right? When we talk about gun violence, I think one of the key drivers for gun violence is poverty. One of the key drivers for poverty is this institutional racism we've seen. And let's be honest, it's not just 50 years, it's not just 100 years, it's since the founding of the nation that we've been dealing with this, and we haven't made this right yet. If you can, I don't know that you can fix the history. That's just never going to happen. But we're still doing some of the same things, maybe just calling it a different name now, and doing some of the same, still having some of the same issues. So when we look at the current landscape of finance and banking, how does a public bank start to rectify some of the issues you talked about?
So I think there's two things. One, Reverend Holston has been working very deeply on this issue of gun violence, and really taking a close look at the 57 blocks across the city that are most impacted. And he talks about it in terms of the Jim Crow of the North, right? And how do we take account for it? And I certainly can't do that by myself today on this call. But I think it is important that we do that kind of accounting and understand the scope and what that does to neighborhoods. So I think that is a starting point, and that's work that needs to be done. And then I think to your second point, while we might not be able to fully fill that, I think you need to understand that hole that's been left, and then what are those mechanisms and things that can fill it. So now we can start talking about things like a public bank. I see the public bank as fitting in part of what needs to be a blossoming of local financial infrastructure. We need a diversity of we need more. We have Philadelphia, luckily, has one of the very few Black-owned banks in the nation, right? There used to be a lot more. If you look at that, just the number of banks, banking is a very successful business. It's easy to make money banking. They don't fail, but there are a lot of mergers. There's this trend of biggering, and the number and diversity of banks has really dwindled down very small. So I think we need some more local financial institutions, PNC, like Pittsburgh has PNC, these large institutions to help ground it. You need a whole diversity of those things. The importance, as we start to talk about things like public banks, or what we have in Philadelphia now is this idea of a public financial authority as a stepping stone to a bank, it's really talking about democratic and transparent governance of how investment decisions are made by those banks. And I think that's really material, because it allows us to begin to step aside from just the strict profit margin of sort of biggering the business itself, and thinking about our economy as a place of people where we get community advocates who are familiar with housing struggles or small business struggles in our local neighborhoods, right? We know what our needs are, and you put those people in charge of thinking through decisions about where we most need to invest in order to grow the economy. And that's something that the city doesn't have right now. If you look at the mayor's refusal to appoint the board of directors to the financial authority, one of the things he's talked about is the fact that there are other agencies, there are other authorities that do this work. He'll talk about the PIDC. The PIDC is very clear in their mission. It's to enhance business opportunities. It's to make Philadelphia a good place for businesses, which is great. That is important work. But that's not the work of making our neighborhoods places to thrive for residents who live here. So I think that's one very important distinction, right? Really raising up residents and neighborhoods into positions of authority for decisions about where we invest our wealth as a community.
Do you see the city maybe saying, okay, we're going to take our operating budget, we're going to put this in the public bank and use that as a repository to make our payments, and then say we're going to take a little bit of that budget and we're going to earmark it towards, let's say, small business loans for parts of the city that have been ignored and subject to redlining.
Yeah, I mean, I think that conversation jumps ahead a little bit. We don't have a public bank yet, and I think as people start thinking about the conversations of taking the full city budget, all of its funds, and sort of holding it in this public bank that doesn't yet exist, I think that can give people agita or sort of get people nervous. But that's why I think this idea of a public financial authority is a stepping stone that begins to build some of the basic infrastructures of transparency, of developing policies, procedures, and practices for how to invest loan funds prudently across the city. And we begin to see how you can build business models charging very modest interest rates, right? To invest credit and money where it needs to be, and folding those returns back into things that could do things like pay down the city's debt. I think it's crazy that 10% of the city's budget every year goes towards debt payments.
Yeah.
If we just took some pockets of our wealth and were investing it ourselves, we could begin to pay down that debt. So I think those are some of the things I like to think about in terms of the incremental ways a public authority could begin to exercise prudence, demonstrate impact, and really build the mechanisms for transparency that starts to bring people and communities into this idea of what is our local economy? What does it look like? How do we make money? Where do we invest it? I think there's a lot of room for education and just getting us to think a little bit more as a collective. Like we are not, I mean, in some respects, we are America's poorest large city, and that's because we haven't been investing in ourselves. But as we start to realize what we have and that we are wealthy, we are the 7th largest deposit market in the country. And if we start to get a little bit more intentional about what we all collectively do with that money, where we invest it, I think that's where we're going to start seeing the economy shift. And then we really get into places where you are in terms of thinking about, great, let's get this public bank chartered and let's really ramp up what we're able to do. Like, I would love to be in a place where we're growing our city budget, not through increased taxes, but through wealth generation, right? It's this thing that can springboard. So I think I think there's so much promise in this idea of a public bank and what it can do. But I think as a city, we also have this public financial authority that city council has put in the mayor's lap right now. And I think this is a really great opportunity for us to start thinking about, well, how can we use this authority to make our economy more fair, make the kinds of investments and move us closer to that eventual public bank. And I think it's important. We need a healthy financial ecosystem. Nothing about what I'm saying is anti-big bank or but it can't be all big bank. We need lots of different financial institutions, and a public bank absolutely should be one of those key institutions for the city.
Okay, I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on the Philadelphia Home Line.
Hi, Nicole, and thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us. You mentioned the authority that City Council chartered and said, hey, look, we want you to do this, Mr. Mayor, but the mayor has pretty much decided he's not going to do it. Where does that impasse stand now? And what can citizens who want to see a little bit more oversight over the city's banking processes do to get that oversight put together, despite what the mayor might want to do?
This is, Denise, this is like where the conversation jumps to one of like financial mismanagement that's happening in the city right now, also to one of like a severe disruption of the democratic process. And it's really disheartening. The Public Banking Coalition and its allies had been doing the work for years, building coalitions, organizing, finally made a lot of great progress last year working with Derek Green, who had been the champion for this legislation, to draft the creation of a public financial authority. They had the Pennsylvania Department of Banking came in and reviewed this legislation. The mayor's department reviewed, edited, commented on this legislation. It passed city council by a vote of 15-1, came back from the mayor without objection. The city clerk put the stamp on it. This is now the law of the land. This ordinance is the law of the land. The mayor shall appoint a board of directors to stand up the public financial authority. And he's not doing it. He's completely disrupting the democratic process. And this is really disheartening. So your question is, what should we do? What do we as a people do? I think we need to stand up and call it out. And we really need to hold our elected officials accountable to the democratic processes that have been established here in this city. That said, how hopeful am I that the mayor is going to get on board and embrace democracy? Not very much. I think right now we're really looking at transition in power. The mayoral election is gearing up for 2023. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do the work, organize, meet with the candidates, and make sure everyone understands how important one, investing in our neighborhoods is, and in particular, investing in our Black neighborhoods. It's important that these candidates understand how a public financial authority and a public bank could help drive investments to where we, the people, need them to go. And I think then fund and support the work of this authority. I think that's what we're looking at. That's the work that needs to be done.
Okay, now in terms of where the city deposits its money, now you said that we're like the 7th largest depository in terms of like banking systems and stuff. You know, is most of that money like stuff that goes into like development for different things, or what? Because I freely admit that the reason why I am a writer is because me and math do not get along at all. So when I'm listening to all of this, and I'm just like your normal average everyday citizen, I'm like, okay, I understand what you're talking about in theory, but how do we put it into practice?
Yeah. So 2 things. The city budget of Philadelphia is not that big, right? It's relatively small. And 10% of that budget is going away towards banks every year. What is large, the pot of money that is large, is the money that me, you, and all 1.5 million of us, plus our 21,000 businesses have sitting in the bank right now. So that's a big pot of money. And in terms of how we operationalize it, that's where I get really excited, because there are things that we can do today, levers that we can pull to hold those banks who have that money accountable for investing more in local communities. And here we're talking about things like the Community Reinvestment Act and fair lending laws. What I think the city needs, and I don't know if it's our treasurer or someone in the mayor's office who's really paying attention, looking at this data, holding banks accountable. The treasurer office today, they produce an annual fair lending sort of statement. It's a booklet. It has a lot of some of the data in it that I'm sharing. But I think we could do a better job than that. So that's we as a public, but I think your question is specifically talking about then the city's budget, our municipal funds that are held by these 13 authorized depositories. And here again, I think is where the treasurer is the one who controls, okay, among those 13 depositories, where are those funds? Are those they at Wells Fargo, TD Bank, United Bank? These are some of the authorized depositories. we could make decisions to say, you know what? If you want to hold our funds, if you want our funds, we need to make sure that you have an outstanding rating in your CRA performance. We want to see your lending totals not have any hint of redlining in them. I want to see your lending to our Black residents be more on par with your lending to our white residents. These are some of the conversations, some of the information that we as a city could start putting out there, publicizing, to hold them accountable, because these are laws. Banks, they hear that and they know that they're on the hook to do a better job. We just need to make some noise and tell them that they need to do a better job. So I think those are some of the things. It's like I look at these laws, these bank laws, almost as strings, like puppet strings that can pull on these banks. And we as a city has just sort of let those strings sit there. I don't know if that metaphor makes sense. We're not,
yeah.
we need to pick them up. We need to pull them. We need to say, hey, you 13 banks, great. We love that. We love that you're doing business with us. Thank you. Here's how you need to do your job in your city if you want to continue to get our business, basically.
Okay.
So
Now
that's,
you mentioned,
go ahead.
sorry, go.
No, and I would say that's a little bit beyond like the way we need a financial management picture, a vision for the city of Philadelphia, and public banking needs to be a part of it. And all of these things are components. We need to better use the laws that are on the books. We need to invest in a plethora of local financial institutions, including a public bank.
Okay, now you mentioned the 2023 mayor's race and the fact that it's looking like that it's going to take that transition to get us to a financial regulatory authority, the one that City Council passed. What should voters be asking the candidates regarding a public bank or regarding just better investment of the city's funds as we go through this mayoral election cycle? Because, everybody can quote you the, 26% poverty rate, many people in deep poverty statistics, but if this is something that can help us get out of that, what should people be asking to, make sure that whether or not the candidate that you're talking to is going to get us to this place?
I think every candidate, we want them to have a day one promise to implement the public financial authority they're coming into office with that in their lap. So we want to know, are you going to implement and fund the public financial authority? I think we want to know, do you agree with the concept that residents, that people here in Philadelphia have a right to make decisions about how we invest our money? I think that needs to be critical just as a philosophy. I want my next mayor to believe that people, residents, community advocates, rather than large businesses, deserve a place making decisions about how we invest our money. And I want to know that the next mayor is going to stand strong and face the corporate banks who are doing business in our city to demand that they do a better job. So I think those are the three things: fund, implement the financial authority, support democracy and sort of the people's economy for Philadelphia, and stand strong about corporate banks and demand they do better. And I think overall, I would like to see a mayor come in that has a sort of a comprehensive financial picture and an understanding for what the problems are in the city, and then a strong plan for how to fix it. And I think public banking and this financial authority are two critical components of that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to us here on Hall Monitor.
Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, Denise.
Nicole, the last thing I'd like to ask you, where can people learn more about public banking and your efforts?
Public banking. So we have a website that we keep very up to date. It's philapublicbanking.org. So please go there. Some of the things that are, you may have seen, we were out at City Hall last week. There's a good group of us out there raising some noise, calling the mayor out for his inaction on the Public Financial Authority. And we served him with a people's subpoena, ordering him to appear before the People's Economic Forum that's going to be held November 17th. So you'll see more information about that on our website. And we're hoping that this is going to be a great forum for people across the city to really talk about the needs and that financial vision for what the city needs and how a public banking movement can help get us there.
All right. Well, Nicole Levy, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you both. It was a pleasure.
Okay, you were listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at BHWWPPM. We'd like to thank Nicole Levy of the Public Bank Coalition for joining us. And I thought that was a really good discussion that outlines what public banking could be, why it's important. First of all, I thought she was excellent at describing that, but also giving us a good snapshot of where we are in the moment. With the mayor not, he didn't veto the legislation because that would have been overturned. But in Philadelphia, it's a little strange how legislation kind of works in this regard. If the mayor doesn't sign a piece of legislation and 10 days goes by, it just automatically gets enacted. Mm-hmm. There isn't technically a pocket veto, except at the end of a 4-year term. If a bill was passed at the end before 10 days before the new council is sworn in, then that's considered a pocket veto. That's the only way that really works. It's a little convoluted and kind of an oddity here in Philadelphia. But the mayor is refusing to appoint the board members or to fund the board itself and the authority itself. So when Nicole said, yeah, we're not optimistic, I'm not either. I don't think he's going to move on this. But there's still hope because we've gotten this far, I think. So Denise, what stood out to you there?
What stood out for me is, and maybe this is just, me thinking if city council passes something and you sign it, you're going to implement it. I still go back to what we asked Derek Green before he resigned. And when we were talking about this, I can't help but think that some of this is personal on the mayor's part. I can't help but think that some of this is directly connected to the people who have asked for it, and he's being petty. And while I would like to think our public officials aren't going to be petty about something this important, I've been covering politics in Philadelphia far too long not to expect that doesn't become a part of the mix.
And I think you have a point there, Denise. So I remember during the committee hearing on the legislation where the mayor's office came out and said, we have reservations. Here's why. And they mentioned a couple of things that they're saying now. Well, okay. But it wasn't like a full-throated kind of like, we really can't do this kind of thing. You didn't hear that at all. Mm-hmm. You didn't hear that at all from anybody. And then all of a sudden, kind of out of the blue, you get this letter saying, no, we're not doing this at all. We're not funding it. We're not appointing the board. And that to me came out of left field because I thought, just based on the way I was kind of reading the tea leaves a little bit, it seemed like, okay, they weren't 100% on board, but they, it passed and they're going to do it. That's what it seemed like to me,
Because, city council says this is what we want, this is what the people want, and you have signed it. It just makes sense that you're going to implement it. But again, I go back to the fact that this is probably one of the most petty cities in America, at least among our political class. And if that figured in to the mayor's calculus, I wouldn't be at all surprised.
Yeah, I agree. So Denise, give us a little bit of what we can expect on Friday from you.
Okay. Here's what you can expect on Friday from me. Usually we get in here and we talk about really serious, very important stuff. And we should, because we have very serious, very important stuff to talk about. But on Friday night, I will be among the people at Citizens Bank Park checking out the Phillies versus the Braves for the National League Division Series. Anyone who is, known me for a while or seen me write in other places knows that I'm a bit of a baseball nut. And I believe that football, basketball, and hockey are just things I have to put up with until baseball season comes around. But in a city like Philadelphia, a city that is so tied to its sports teams, I wanted to talk a little bit about how sometimes that allows us to not see the very serious stuff that we need to talk about. So while I'm going to be talking about the fact that, okay, as a city we have something to celebrate, for the first time in 11 years the Phillies are back in the playoffs, and they even won a game yesterday. They tried really hard to give away, but they didn't. And they have Zach Wheeler coming on the mound tonight, which is a kind of a good omen. We also have to talk a little bit about how maybe if we put some of the same effort that we do into cheering for the Eagles and the Phillies and the Flyers and the Sixers into cheering for ourselves, we might be a little better off.
I agree with you, Denise, and I am also a huge Phillies fan, and excited about what we have going on. And just to let everybody know, the game was supposed to be played at about 4:30 this afternoon.
Yeah, it's been moved to 7:30 tonight.
Yeah, so actually that's better for me because these day games I don't get a chance to see much. So I'm glad it's 7:30 now.
And there is a tie into the city budget because we, from city revenues, pay for the stadiums. Every time there's a playoff game, that means we have to take less money out of the general fund to pay for the multi-millionaire owners of the stadiums, and we have a little bit more money to go around for the rest of us.
Exactly.
So if the Phillies do well, it does help us in the general fund. In fact, we should refuse to pay them if they do poorly.
I'm with
I like
you.
that idea.
And you touched on something that's just a major issue with me. We always hear about how the owners of these teams are billionaires, yet they take state, federal, and local funds to build these stadiums, and it just drives me insane. It drives me nuts.
That is the perfect segue into the public bank again, because if we had a public bank, it wouldn't cost us so much to finance these stadiums. Whether we should build them or we shouldn't build them, we shouldn't build them where they cost extra so that a bank can make extra profit.
And one of the problems, the issues that we have, we're still paying off the debt for Citizens Bank Park and the Eagles Stadium and where the Sixers and Flyers play. So how does that kind of work? And that ties into what you're going to tell us a little bit about today.
Right. So I thought the public bank presentation was great. I understand what's being talked about when we talk about all of the money in the region. I'd like to focus tonight on being a little more granular and talking not so much about everybody's money, but talking about the city's money. And one of the things I think is going to be clear is how much the city gives away to the private banks and to the bond councils and to all of the people who make money through the banking system. So I'm going to call up my presentation if I can. Thank you. And so let's talk a little bit about what the city owes. So the city borrows money, and they borrow money through debts. And those debts have to be paid off. And when they're paid off through the sinking fund. And the city itself says that they have made strides in reducing debts. But the burden, when combined with other fixed costs, such as pension liabilities, the burden this limits the city's financial flexibility and makes it harder for us to keep going. So instead of having money to invest in our neighborhoods, to invest in our schools, to invest in anti-violence programs, we are being constrained because we have borrowed so much money from the private banking industry that we don't have the resources we need to take care of us. 15% of the city budget goes to pay the city's debt. and these aren't my numbers, these come from the mayor's 5-year plan. This debt expense uses up a large portion of the city's financial capacity and will continue to be a significant budgetary expense through the 2020s. In fiscal year 22, which is the year we're in now, current pension costs accounted for approximately 15% of the general fund expenditures. The sinking fund, though, ends up costing us more. And it's not just the debt, the city's debt. It's the city's debt. It's the water department's debt. It's the air board's debt. It is all of the debts that we have when we borrow money. So the gas works, the water department, the airport, and the city's been very successful at finding ways to even borrow more. And this year, the city sent a letter to City Council saying that it's going to explain how much money is owed. And this letter, I'm going to read directly from the letter. This letter is an introduction and overview of the City of Philadelphia's report on bonded debt and other long-term obligations. As of June 30th, 2020, the city's total bonding debt outstanding amounted to $8,351,000,000. So again, the city has managed to borrow over $8 billion. And in the last year alone, you can see how much money the city has borrowed. Now, I know there are some people who are opposed to borrowing, and that's not what we're discussing this evening. Tonight, we're going to talk about who are we borrowing from and why are we borrowing from them. The reason why the city has debt and the water department has debt, the gas works and the airport, is we use those debt to build capital projects. And let's say, for example, we're going to replace a water main. Well, that water main should last for at least 20 years. So we want to spread the cost of it over 20 years. And the only way we can do that is we borrow and we pay off 1/20th of it, plus the interest, plus all the fees that are associated with borrowing. So there's nothing intrinsically wrong with saying if we're going to have a long life of the asset, whatever we're building, whatever we're buying, whatever we're using is going to continue to provide city services for 20 years. There's nothing wrong with saying we're going to take 15 or 20 years to pay for it. In fact, that's more fair, because if we didn't do it like that, then we would put the burden on people who are paying it this year who may not be in the city or may not actually be alive in 20 years.
And Lance, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it that when the property, because we've been talking about property assessments a lot, when the property value goes up, it enables the city to borrow more because it's a percentage of the value of the property in the city.
That's right. If we have enough time, we'll get to that. But
Okay.
That's why the city prefers raising assessments as opposed to raising the tax rates. If the city raised the tax rates, the city would not be able to borrow additional money without putting it on the ballot and giving people an opportunity to say yes or no. When the city raises the assessment, as you point out, what it does is it increases the borrowing power of the city. And when we switched the way we assess properties from the old system to what we call AVI, the actual value initiative, what we successfully did was increase the city's borrowing by a tremendous amount, such a large amount, in fact, that the city has not had to put up a bond issue on the ballot for many years. So this slide is what I want to call attention to. The blue part of this slide, and I realize it's hard for people to see it, the blue part isn't what we owe. The blue part is the interest we pay to private banks. And as you look at that, you can see that in the what they call the out years, the right side of the graph shows that it's getting less and less. But that's not realistic. That's just an approximation, not taking into account that the city is going to continue to borrow. So if you look at it, in some years, it's 40% of what we're paying goes to interest. And again, here's how it works. The city wants to borrow money to pay for repairs or a new building or water department for a new water treatment plant. And what they do is they go to a bond council and they hire a law firm. And then they go to an investment house, an investment bank, and they hire an investment bank. And then they pay fees to have it rated. And then they pay additional fees if they want to make sure that the bondholders are happy. And then they purposely over collect. They call it a coverage ratio. So if the city borrows $100, the city says we're going to collect $120 so that you, the bondholder, don't have to worry about never being paid. So that's how it works right now. The sad part is it doesn't have to work like that. And who pays for these bonds? There are some bonds which are called revenue bonds that come from the gas works or come from the water department or come from the airport. But the general obligation bonds come out of the city's operating budget. And as the city itself says, because we've borrowed so much money, we don't have enough money to invest in our neighborhoods because we're paying the interest on these loans to the banks. And this is just a list of all the outstanding general obligation bonds. And I know there's a lot of language that's used that makes it hard for people to follow. But a general obligation bond is simply a way of saying the city borrowed money and the city's going to take it out of the general fund to pay for it. Now, the reason why I put this up was for people to see what the interest rates are. And these interest rates are as much as 5%. And as the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest, these interest rates are going to continue to go up. So when we looked at that graph where we saw 40% was being paid in interest, that's actually going to increase. And where does that interest go? Who gets that interest and why is that a problem? So I'm going to skip ahead so I don't waste our time. When we look at that, that's where the public bank comes into play. So the public bank could lend the city money itself. And what I mean by that is the city already, I'm sorry, let me just focus on this for just a second. As I talked about who makes money when the city decides not to use a public bank. And here's a list of the major law firms in the city of Philadelphia who are bond counsel. And again, this is not my research. This just comes from when the city files its normal reports on bonds. And you can look through the list, and we'll put it up on the webpage for later. You can look through the list at your leisure, but what you will see is the major law firms that are participating in helping the city are the ones who get the contracts to do the bond work. And if we had a public bank, they wouldn't get that work anymore. This is the point you were making, Larry, why the city likes to raise the assessments and not raise the tax rates. This comes from the Pennsylvania Constitution. The debt of the city of Philadelphia may be increased in such an amount that the total debt of said city shall not exceed 13.5% of the average of the annual assessed valuation of the taxable realty. So this year, when everyone's taxes goes up, the city of Philadelphia is going to be able to borrow even more. And the city knows that. The city says as a result of the implementation of the city's actual value initiative, which changed the city's assessments from capturing a fraction of property values to capturing their full value, the assessed value of taxable real estate within the city increased substantially, causing the constitutional debt limit to increase and no longer be a limiting factor on new debt service, a new debt issuance. Issuance is just a fancy way of saying we borrow money. So this switch to AVI was a huge benefit to the private banks because the city can now borrow without asking the public's permission, without having to have an election. And how much debt have we borrowed? To put it in perspective, again, $8.45 billion in long-term outstanding debt. Each Philadelphian currently owes $2,294. Each Philadelphian pays in 1 year $238 to pay off those bonds. If we had a public bank, that number would be far lower. Now, as we heard earlier, there's a question as to where the city puts its money. And sometimes we think the city is broke, and the city certainly struggles. But the city has tons of cash that it keeps, and it deposits in a bank. And we can look at that. The city's fund balance now is $372 million. Yes, part of it's from the American Rescue Plan, but still, the city has $372 million in a bank somewhere. It also has $41 million from the stabilization reserve, and it has money from the water department, and it has money from the gas works, and it has money from all the other departments. So just to keep it in mind, these are all examples, and it'll be on the webpage of how much cash there is. But right now, what we're looking at is the city's general fund has $372 million in a bank somewhere. The sinking fund, which pays off the debt, has to keep the money somewhere so it can make the payments on a regular basis, has $182 million. The water department, $142 million. The airport, $266 million. And the gas works has $224 million. The total amount the city has that we have direct control over, I'm not talking about SEPTA money, I'm not talking about the stadium authority money, I'm not talking about anything the city may not be able to control completely. Just the cash on hand that the city controls, $1.187 billion. And here's what we do. We put that money in the bank, and then when the city wants to borrow money, we borrow it from the bank instead of getting our own money. So the money in the bank pays us less than 1%. Now that is going to go up as the interest rates go up. But we lend money, we get 1% back for the money we invest, and we borrow money and we pay roughly 5%. So what we're looking at is how much money we lose because we choose to use a private bank rather than a public bank. It's $36 million a year. Over 15 years, you can see it's almost $500 million. Now, the idea of a public bank isn't a new one. The Bank of North Dakota has existed for over 100 years, and they do exactly what we've been talking about. They invest in local businesses. They help students get student loans. But the most important function they have is they protect the taxpayers. So what they do is they take all of those deposits that we looked at, and it goes into the Bank of North Dakota. And then the Bank of North Dakota lends money to the governments at a much reduced interest rate. It's been so successful that the state-owned Bank of North Dakota has reported a profit every year for the last 100 years. They have returned 15%. While they do that, they also keep taxes down. So we're going to put all this up on the webpage. But what the mayor has done by refusing to follow the law is he has said to the taxpayers of Philadelphia, we're not going to give you a break. We're not going to help you out. And what he has said to the private banks in Philadelphia is we are going to give you an excess profit. And to the big law firms, we're going to give you bond counsel fees. And to the technical experts, we're going to pay your fees as well. Just one small point. When you look through that list of lawyers who get paid as bond counsel, you'll find an interesting name, Andre Desant. Andre Desant not only makes money as bond counsel, he also is the water department's lawyer and is active in the water rate increases. So every time he gets a water rate increase, he also turns around and gets to be a bond counsel and makes money on both sides. If there was a public bank, he would lose. We would win. Our gas rates would go down, our water bills would go down, and we would have more tax dollars to use for the things that we need.
I can't help but think that $36 billion that we lose as a result of this could have built at least 5 or 6 brand new schools with state-of-the-art computing software and everything kids need to be competitive in the 21st century, a while ago.
Yeah. You're right. It's just so enraging. It's one of those things that makes it very hard not to call for conspiracy theories. Here it is. Yeah. A very conservative state, North Dakota, which I don't think has elected a Democrat in 50 years, has a public bank. And here in so-called progressive city of Philadelphia, we have a mayor who refuses to follow the law and fund a public bank.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Lance, thank you so much. Nicole Levy, thank you for joining us. Denise, thank you as always. And we will be back next week with Home Monitor.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.